Hello, and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And as usual, I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy.
And Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. So tonight, as we record, for the first time that it feels in quite a while, we don't have a guest with us. And the three of us had decided that we wanted to gather and we wanted to give some time and space to a really important topic and issue, the caregiver experience. We've actually tried to record on this issue previously, and we had two wonderful guests who we are going to have come back and speak. And they're going to speak more about the experience, the journey with dementia and caregiving. But tonight, we thought that we would gather and speak about the caregiver experience in terms of end-of-life care. And I think that we're going to speak from our own personal experiences in caregiving and also our experiences in supporting families and caregivers in end-of-life care.
And I think it's a very important topic, Julie, that often caregivers, even although we acknowledge them, that in so many different ways they fall through the cracks, and also in their own ability to express what it is that's needed and helpful. And so there's a huge amount of weight that gets placed on caregiving, especially if the trajectory goes on for any length of time. The needs change and people change and the situations change, but the caregivers are the same ones that have to find the ability to do this. So I think in our discussions with the three of us, we decided that this would be a good start too, is to talk from our own experiences, both with personal, as you mentioned, but also in our supporting of caregivers. So I'm glad we're doing this tonight. And you both have great experience in this too. So I think it'll be a good discussion. So maybe just to kind of get us going, maybe we can identify what's some of the initial things that we would want to say about caregiving. What is it that we have observed over the years, both in others or in ourselves in caregiving?
I think that quite often it's interesting because the caregivers usually, or quite often, is the person or persons closest to the individual with the life-threatening illness. And as a result, then, you are sort of given or you assume this extra role that takes you out of being family, that takes you out of being that personal, there's a personal touch or a personal connection to that person. And then somehow you are now a caregiving professional. You are, if especially if things like physical care needs or medication needs are high and strong, you're playing you've got this dual role where you're the responsible person for the caregiving, but you're also the person closest to the individual, and there's all of that emotional upheaval or emotional intensity that's there, that sometimes in the caregiving role has to be put on hold in order to be able to do the role.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking really about how, so if we just use the example of, for me, I'm the daughter and I have my experiences watching an ailing parent who requires care and all the feelings, the experience I have as a daughter watching a parent go through that. So that's one role, right? That's one experience. But then I also then have the experience of what is it like to be the caregiver. And as you say, Red, having to put some of maybe my own processing of what I'm feeling, thinking aside and attend to what's immediate, which is often the caregiving, which is why sometimes there's a lot of work to do later on in the grieving, because we haven't had maybe the time, the space to really process our own experience.
And I remember us doing that episode on the value of the vigil, and yet, as you say, Julie, sometimes we're so busy in the caregiving the values of those things we don't have a chance to really absorb because we're so busy with the caregiving. I was thinking too, while you were talking, that there's that piece of expectation that children may be expected to be caregivers. Nobody really asks them to, are you prepared to be a caregiver? Either by volunteering what it's going to take emotionally and time-wise, but also just the ability to do what is being asked of you. So I think because we don't as families usually talk about that till the time comes or gets near, that sometimes we have this expectation that, oh, somebody, so and so, my daughter, and usually let's face it, usually it is the daughters who get looked to first as the ones to provide that caregiving, whether or not that's the right thing to do. So there's a lot of expectation that's there that we have to deal with.
And I think that expectation, you think about it, it's, people love to be at home, and that's, people, where do I want to be? I want to be at home, and that's great. And then the person doesn't want to, the person who may be dying doesn't want to feel like a burden. We've talked about burden before on a podcast, because they know that burden of caregiving is falling to whoever those closest people are in their circle. But unlike being in a hospital or in a hospice, where nursing staff work for 8 to 12 hours, go home and get a break, when you are the caregiver, it quite often is 24 hours a day. That the disease and some of the symptoms of the disease don't recognize that it's 3 a.m. and you need to get some sleep. No, you're up at 3 a.m. and you're doing caregiving, and that clock just keeps going. And that sense of, I was just talking to a gentleman the other day who, it's 8 months that this has been happening. And I said, you are now really in that place where it's closer. It's, as you move closer through time, it's getting closer to the end. And when that time comes, he's going to have 8, 9, 10 months of exhaustion backing him up as he enters into his grief. Anticipatory grief now. But when the time comes, he's going to be, entering his grief from a place where his energy level is down. His emotional level is just wrung out. And now he's going to have the issue now of full-on grief. And so he's coming to that from a place of, I'm exhausted after 8 months of being a caregiver.
The other thing that can happen, as you know, Red and Julie, we've heard this so many times, that if that caregiver is a family member and the person who is in the trajectory of dying may be a very, personal, have a very closed situation, and they don't want the other professional help that might be available to come in. So they refuse. They say, no, we don't want a PSW. We don't need one. My daughter's here. My son's here. They'll look after it. And so there's that often that extra load that doesn't give them the break that we would hope they could get from that extra professional piece that comes in.
I just want to, in reference to that feeling of the long haul and the exhaustion that happens, I just want to kind of say something briefly, that a theme that has emerged for me once the death has happened is that it's really natural for the caregiver to experience some relief. And then with that relief comes guilt. And, so many times I've sat across from somebody and saying, but the relief isn't that you're glad they're died. The relief is that you needed the caregiving, the burden, the exhaustion to come to an end, right? And so it's important. And I just want to just take a moment just to normalize that if there is relief, or let's say the person hasn't died, but you get away for a weekend because other caregivers move in and you just feel like, I need to get away. I want to get away. Again, that guilt can come up. And the guilt is not about an absence of love or devotion or commitment to caring. It's about, I need some relief from the exhaustion, from the just the constancy of the burden, of the caregiver burden.
And I think further onto that, with that guilt, it can be, did we make the right decisions? Did we do everything that we should have done? Did we, did we go all the way and get the extra mile? Did the work that we just do, was it the right work? And I think, did we make the right decisions? Because sometimes the decision making, again, can fall onto the family caregiver to make decisions about certain care needs. And when it's all over, the guilt of, I don't know why we go so quickly to guilt, but we really do. And like I think you said it really clearly, Julie, it's not about wishing the person had died. It's about being thankful that their suffering is over. And as a result, now your exhaustion is still going to be there, but that role that you had as a caregiver is now gone. And it was that role as caregiver that was weighing you down. Now it will weigh you down, or what might feel heavy is your grief. But it isn't a joy that the person has died. It's a relief from the burden of caregiving.
I've witnessed so many families just so lovingly, with real commitment and devotion, care for their family member. And I've been amazed at how many times still go to grief or still go to guilt. Once did we do enough? Did we make the right decisions? And times where I've been shocked by it because I thought, wow, like this is a family that really walked to the person right, with so much love and care right to the very end of their life. And then what comes up immediately is guilt. So there is something there where we just tend to, and part of that I think is the grappling we do quite naturally with there's so much uncertainty, there's so much unknown when we're caregiving, and we're making decisions at the moment with the information we have, and it's just so natural when we're in a different place to look back on that and say, now that I know this, would we have done something different?
And along with that, Julie, I think there's this confliction that we live in between we are able to do what we can caregiving, but we can't change the disease. And I think, and so you ask, why do we have that always, as Red said, why do we go to guilt so quickly? I think part of it is that we know we can do this, and we do it, and I agree. I've watched people do it amazingly and then turn to the guilt, but there's that piece of, but I couldn't change the disease, and I couldn't make it better. I couldn't make them live longer. And so I think that drives the guilt more than it gets talked about in terms of, did we do enough? But I'm convinced that it has more to do with my sense of inability to deal with what it is that's where this person is going.
The powerlessness,
Mm-hmm.
the lack of control that we have, right? What you're really talking about there is, I may have control over how I show up, that I'm present, that I move through my caregiving role, but in the end, I still really don't have control, right, over this disease, this condition, the symptoms. Yeah.
In all of that, I think we need to remember and remind caregivers they do a great job. Is it enough? Well, it's probably never enough in when we look at it. But my gosh, when I think of the incredible love that some families and caregivers and friends, not just family, I mean, it's a wide scope of caregiving that can happen. And I am amazed at the wonderful work that they do to not to make that person better, but to allow that life to be lived differently in the moment in a way that makes it so much better than it might be if they weren't there.
Yeah, and I think the goal and understanding in this situation, that the goal is a good death. The goal is comfort. The goal is love and care. Because we learn, if we do our jobs well and we do them right, and we're right on top of things, that the outcome is positive. It will have a positive outcome. And when the positive outcome is a good death, sometimes we focus more on the death, the loss. If I had done this right, maybe they would have lived longer. Maybe it wouldn't have happened at all. Whereas actually the work and the goal was a good death. And that can sometimes be hard to hold on to, especially when you're emotionally attached to the person who you've been caregiving for and who's just died. Right. And so I think that really, and I think that sense of responsibility, even more so when the person is at home. I've recently had some experiences with this, and we were doing things that we'd never done before. Giving IV medications, and I'm not a nurse. I remember I texted back to my to my manager and said they didn't teach us this in social work school, how to give sub-Q morphine. I don't know, and I'm the one doing it. And you're alone, like it's the middle of the night and you're alone and you're doing it and you're going, wow, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse. I really hope I'm doing this right. And that can be that was a huge sense of responsibility. Like the weight of that was probably stronger than I realized in the moment, because in the moment it was, you have to be this person who can do this. You have to be the person who can do this. Not necessarily you are the person who can do it, but you are the person who has to do it. And it was just a strange place to be in. And then afterward, that sense of responsibility of, oh wow, that it was all on our shoulders. And then you start to double guess: did we do everything all right? Did we give this individual the death that they should have had? Should we have made different decisions? And then he had to go back through was, well, no, nothing we did made this happen. There were several diseases at play that had come to their natural conclusions, and therefore the life had come to its natural conclusion. But you go through that as you relive what just happened. And I think another thing about that too is time starts to feel real different. You start to feel out of time somehow. We were going back trying to remember the order of how things happened, and it was just confusing. None of us could remember what day was that, what happened then, and when was that decision made, and where were we at that point. And so time and memory just started to lose its meaning and lose its sense of linearness. And it just became one great big experience. And so when the outcome then becomes death at the end, your memory is scrambled. You're going, wow, what just happened, right? And now I'm back in this other role of family, let's say.
Such good points, Red. Thank you for sharing a part of your experience with that. I was thinking in preparation for recording this podcast, I was looking over some of the literature, the research, and looking at the experience of caregivers who are working and trying to be caregivers, maybe their parents, they have other roles that demand a lot from them in their life. And then what starts to happen to us as well when, we talk about exhaustion, when we actually, caregiving can feel all consuming and like a full-time job. And then what happens when we already actually have a full-time job? And then if we layer onto that, we have children or we have other commitments as well. And how do we know when it's time to step away from the job, to take a leave? How do we know, what's typical fatigue and when we actually feel like we've hit our wall and we need to step away? And kind of, as you were just saying, Red, like exist in that bubble of time where this is my job kind of in the world right now. This is what I'm doing. I'm kind of letting other things go. And I recognize there's privilege in what I'm saying, because not everybody, of course, can take a leave of absence. Not everybody has an employer that will support that, or where there's, funding or whatever. But I just kind of want to just acknowledge that sometimes people are in a caregiving role where they have tremendous other demands on them.
And I was taken, Red, with what you just said there in terms of wow, I know they didn't teach you that in social work, but you've been in healthcare. and you've been in palliative care, you've been around nursing, you've been around people in those things. And if you felt that way, what does that mean to somebody who has had no experience in any of that and feels the need, oh my gosh, I'm the one who has to give that subcu needle to make sure that morphine gets there. So I was just taken when listening to you thinking, oh my gosh, the majority of people wouldn't have even the healthcare experience that you have. So what's it like for them? And then, as you say, Julie, that the other experiences of life that have us there. So, and that brings me to the point that, are we getting better? I don't know. I would like to think we are systemically better to allow for caregiving as a legitimate, valid reason for people to take leaves of absence and get paid. Now, there is the compassionate leave that is possible from the government, but you have to have it's time limited. So you're playing this guessing game of, when should I take that? When is the best time? Because if you take it too early, then you don't have it when you need it, when you really want it. Plus, it's not you don't get your full salary. So again, it's a privilege piece to where certain people might be able to do that. But given our economics and the way things are, it's not a lot of people that have that opportunity. So I think, adding to caregiving is this inability to do what we feel we need to do in a way that's supported economically and other ways to give us a chance to do that. And and I don't have an answer for that, but boy, I think that's a big piece of it too.
And I just wanted to just sort of step back there. You reminded me of something when you were talking to David, is that sense of, we've talked about burden and responsibility. The burden, I think the burden comes from the responsibility, the feeling of responsibility, not necessarily the caregiving. I mean, caregiving, I think, yes, sure, it does. But I look at caregiving as that's based on love. Okay, I can do these things and I can do. But then if you have those other responsibilities that another profession would take on, then that concept of responsibility that was more burdensome in my situation that I felt than being, if those responsibilities and roles weren't present. Of course you're going to be tired, but you're not going to be anywhere else. You love this person, and so you are going to maybe push yourself to the point of exhaustion. You're going to not take the advice and have the lunch that someone says you need to eat. Yeah, you know what? No, I need to be right here, right now. And you can get into those little battles. You're like a dog with a bone. No, I'm not going. Yes, I'm going. You need to eat. I'm not hungry. Those things. I think that's just part of the dynamic of caregiving, is that people will go to the nth degree. But some of the exhaustion came from more of those responsibilities that were really outside of my experience, right? So maybe they just added an extra layer. And I think when we think about home care and people at home, that's something that we maybe don't think about all the time, is that those extra responsibilities of giving very strong drugs to someone. It might be conscious or unconscious, but it sits there, I think.
Very, very well put, Red. And I like that idea that it's that doing the work of other professionals that gives us that responsibility and that heaviness. And the truth is, as we all know, that you cannot get 24/7 home care. It's just not possible. We're not going to get the nursing there at 2 a.m. And so we have those pieces that we have to do. So, which brings me to we've talked, and we could probably talk for hours on the challenges and all the struggles of caregiving, the heaviness, and I mentioned before we started the podcast, I was with a group of caregivers in a room, and I just felt the heaviness that was there, of trying to keep this going for longer periods of time. But I'm interested to hear from both of you in terms of what is it that we can do in caregiving that that may allow us to do this in a way that is better, not just for the person we're caregiving, but for us as caregiving. How do we do this? What do we say to people, to them in their situation?
So one of the things that I think about is that we have to draw on our own social capital. And that sounds very like a very cold term, but we have to think about you're giving to this person, and where are you going to allow people to give to you or to give to this situation? And one of the things as human beings around care, giving and receiving is the reality is we're actually much better at giving than we are receiving, or certainly for asking for help. And asking for help feels vulnerable. And there's a lack of control that comes with it. And so it can put us in this place where we become quite stoic and, like the martyr, where we're doing the giving and the giving, even when we know we're giving past our own limits. And at some point, what we really need to look around is look at our own kind of social reservoirs, and where are there people that can buoy us up, if not the individual, but then at least us. So if I'm at my parents' place and I'm caregiving all the time, can I let my neighbor just, cut my grass, right? Or can I ask for help from the friend who keeps saying, what can I do for you? Can I say, you know what, if I give you a list of groceries that I need, could you pick them up? Right? And so really what we need to do is allow this chain of reciprocity to happen that is often available to us. And even if we don't have, good friends doing it, most of us have neighbors that mean well, or maybe part of our faith community or our workplace, where there are just kind, compassionate people, who say that whole, like, let me know if I can help. But then most of us don't actually ever say anything about, we really need to draw upon that if we want to be able to sustain ourselves as caregivers. And yet that seems so obvious as I say it, but people have a really hard we have a really hard time texting back to people and saying, you know what, it would be really great if you could pick up my groceries or pick up my child, or, or run them here or do this or cut my lawn. It's very hard for us to do. And yet, when we don't do that, we are depriving other people of the opportunity to be generous. And generosity feels good for us as human beings. We like being generous. Most of us want to be generous in spirit. And so one of the ways I think we can buoy ourselves up is to allow the chain of reciprocity to continue far beyond us.
How did you do this, Red? If you don't mind, I know you've come through a couple of them recently, and you've alluded to that. What was helpful for you as a caregiver in that whole process?
Well, in my situation, they were both, I would say, relatively quick. And so there was no, I mean, I shouldn't say relatively quick. The end was relatively quick, if that makes any sense. I think for us, it was making sure that we were, those that needed to be there were there. And that we certainly had the support. What did you call it, Julie? Our social capital. I call them friends, but we certainly had a circle of friends that buoyed us up. And what they did, which was just sometimes a text, sometimes it was food. Just that sense that you knew that people were out there. I'm gonna just switch a story. I was talking to someone recently, and the bombardment of people calling to find out how things are, and that it's just like, I don't have enough time as a caregiver to do all the things I need to do. I don't have all this time to answer emails and texts and phone messages, and they were getting to that point where it's like I need to be I'm becoming a very strong gatekeeper, you know. So sometimes caregiving is being able to know how to protect the cocoon that is around of the people who get it and are there being supportive. Yes, the people outside that are interested and concerned, but sometimes that can be just a lot of static and a bit too much to be able to manage. Didn't have that in our situation. I think in both situations we sort of knew what was going on, and because they were relatively quick, once 4 or 5 days, the process of getting there was a while, but I think that we were very clear on what was happening. We knew what was happening. We kept that frame of mind, and we said, okay, this is happening. How much energy do we have? And of course, like you said, Julie, we would have pushed ourselves probably beyond. And I think as a caregiver, someone who wanted to try to stop me from doing that, I would have barked at. Don't tell me how much energy I have. You know what I mean? But at the same time, boy, if you wanted to bring me some lunch, that would be great. And that just sounds so stupid, because if I go to work, I take a break. You know what I mean? Like, I take lunch. The water cooler chat happens, but for some reason in this role, it just seems so. And that's where I think that the responsibility, that the sense of this is what we have to do now, and it's such a focus that the outside world kind of disappears. And just those folks that you need in that circle, that inner circle, if they're there, then I think people will feel okay, because you can trade each other off inside that circle. I think one of the things that is really difficult for caregivers is when maybe it's mom or dad who's dying, and I'm the son or daughter, and I live locally, and my brothers and sisters live away, and all of that burden falls on me, right? And then someone comes in from BC, swoops in from BC and says, I'm here for a week, and I'm gonna make this right. And everything that I've been doing for the last 3 months seems to have been wrong, or I'm being criticized for it. That's really hard for caregivers. I've seen that many, many times, where a family member swoops in from out of town, is maybe a little more judgmental than they should be. But then what do? They swoop right back out again. They create a little bit of chaos, they disrupt the pattern and the routine, and then they head back to where where they don't have these roles and responsibilities anymore, where they're going to get a good night's sleep, where they don't have to be responsible for giving the medications or turning someone in bed or changing changing the linen, changing their clothes, helping them shower, getting them to the bathroom if they're still able to ambulate. And they go back, and then they phone in and ask how things are going. And I think I've heard that that's very hard for a caregiver to know. I think that level of burden of responsibility weighs heavy on that person who is the local person when they have other siblings or other family that are from away. I see you shaking your head, Julie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I've also seen a beautiful example of where that's worked differently, where I've seen the family member who lives far away. I've actually seen this a few times, and they became very clear as a caregiver from a distance that one of the things they could do is support their siblings who were there with the ailing parent. And so they're like, okay, you're there. So this is that reciprocity chain, right? So what, I can't be there to help you with the day to day, but as your sibling, I can be here to really support and love you and support you as you're there being the caregiver. So I just kind of want to, kind of say, like, I think that is one of the ways it can work. But I've also definitely seen that example read where the person swoops in and there ends up being judgment. And man, that just feels really hard. That feels really hard for the people that have been living it day in and day out.
And I think that judgment comes from them being not there, watching a process. And so they come in and they come in after many months of a process that's made sense, and the individual who's present sees. And so they're on the ride. And all of a sudden they're joining the roller coaster mid-ride, and they're just not in sync, and then that un in sync, that what's un in sync, that lack of synchronicity just sometimes can create that friction, right?
And that in both cases, have long-term impact. So in the case that you described, Red, excuse me, when they come in and they, take over and they change and they're judgmental, when the person dies, that relationship is fractured and it likely is not going to be a healthy one. In the case where they are supportive, as you mentioned, Julie, that only strengthens that bond after the death. So I think caregiving is that period that has long-term impact possibilities, depending on how our family and our friends that are close, how they connect to us during that time. I wanted to pick up just one thing you said, Red, about you used the phrase when the people who needed to be there were there, which brings me to the point of I I think that one of the keys in long-term caregiving is, as you say, Julie, understanding the social impact of who it is that we can draw on. But then when you ask somebody else to go and sit with that person or be with that person for a day, how do you disengage so that when you're not there, you're really not there in order to refresh, as opposed to, you're checking in every 5 minutes. Even if you don't do it physically, your mind is always back there. So how do we disengage for that period that gives us a chance to renew ourselves that way?
I think that's a great question. I think that's a skill, a muscle we have to build. And you're so right, David. I'm thinking of this situation where the individual would step away from their spouse, and that was exactly it. They had a physical break, but it wasn't a break for them because they were consumed with worry and fretting about what was happening. And over time, part of that is the relinquishing of control, right? That when I'm not there, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that person will do it the way will do it, or that nothing bad will happen, right? And so what happens in caregiving can be this real bracing, tightness that we're holding on so tight. And then we know we need to break away, but then we step away. And if we step away and we really step away, we have to let go. We have to drop the rope, right? We're in this tug of war. We have to drop the rope. And that's a hard thing for us to do.
And I think that dynamic changes or is different depending on the length of time or the trajectory of the disease process and how much caregiving is required. I think of the experiences I've had lately; they were short in comparison. They weren't like 6, 7, 8, 9 months. But if it's a 6, 7, 8, 9 month process of that level of caregiving, I think over the time the human body is going to say, "I can't do it forever. I am run down. I have maybe gotten sick because of my, the stress in my immune system down, and I picked something up." And so I think the trajectory of the illness and the level of care that's required and the length of time will probably come up with different answers to your question, David, depending on the length and the spectrum of that process. Because maybe it might be a little bit easier if it's a long trajectory to say, wow, okay, I need to create a team that allows me to go away, and I'm going to go away for a weekend. And guess what? It's like being a new parent almost. You're constantly tired. You're constantly up in the middle of the night, but you're going to do it, and you're going to get up and you're going to go to work the next day, and you're going to do it because this is your role, this is your job. And then the new parents get to go away for a weekend for the first time, and what do? They sit around, they talk about their child, because they can't necessarily get away from it over a course of the length of a dinner, let's say, if we've gone out for dinner. But I think if it's a longer term, then we learn how to do that. And that the importance of doing that becomes heightened, and the experience of doing it allows us to understand that if we do it, it doesn't mean we don't love that person. It doesn't mean that we don't care for that person. It just means that in order to continue to do those things for that person, we need to have a wee break.
Just thinking, a couple families are coming to mind that I've journeyed with through their caregiving and then the individual's end of life to death. And one family in particular stands out in my mind, who just really did it well. And I'm not trying to say that, you can do it bad or good, and I'm not grading it, but here's what I saw in that family is that they became very clear at who was good at what part of the caregiving role. So I can remember in this family that there was one of the adult children who were just really able to attend to their parents' more existential distress, their emotional needs. So they were just really exceptional at holding the space for that. And then there were another couple family members who, of course, were still loving and wanted to attend to that, but they were actually just really good at some of the practical things and really good at having the conversations with the home care, healthcare professionals that would come in and making sure everything was, we have things where they need to be in terms of medication and the physical care. And there was this real deep respect between the family members for what each other was offering. And then there was also this sense of peace of knowing that the person they loved so dearly was really getting this real wholesome, full care. And I know that's not something that all families can do, but I kind of wanted to share that because I was privileged enough to be in this person's home many times and watch this unfold and watch not just the care they were giving to the individual, but how there was this deep respect and care for each other and what each other could bring to the caregiving situation.
Thank you for that, Julie, because I think what I'm hearing that I think could be practical giving of advice, and I'm not going to use that word, but of counsel to caregivers is two things. One, we need to ask for help, but secondly, we need to ask in the right place and the right person. And I appreciate that. And that's absolutely true for all of us in developing a support system, is we need different types of support. And it's not a hierarchy of one being more important than the other. It's valuing our support system in a way that honors the individual and the person for the skills they can bring, and not expect them to be what they can't be in this, because you can do that short term, but over time, that's the one that really gets to us. So if I love your example, if I'm that one who can sit with my parent in that existential piece and listen and be a listener, then 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 I need to accept that's my role, that's my place. It doesn't mean I won't ever be asked to do something practical, but the majority of my focus can be that, and I can see that as being, that's my contribution, and it's good, and it's okay. And just because I'm not the one running, attending to all the physical pieces, it doesn't mean my role is less or more. So again, that kind of conversation with caregivers of saying, okay, so what is it that we can do? Here's what I can provide, but here's some things, I just feel are going to be more draining on me because it's extra work. Now, again, not every situation has that blessing to be able to do that. And I recognize that there are people who are trying to balance all those balls because they just don't have the support of family. But if they do, I really think what I'm hearing from both of you is to encourage this kind of conversation right at the beginning, and to say the expectations are reasonable without becoming onerous, and not just expectations on volume of work, but on the type of things that we do and we can offer, and how do we do this best, and how do we look after each other.
Just thinking, and sometimes we don't know what those strengths will be, right? Sometimes we don't know what we're going to be good at, or what other people in the family. And as you were talking, David, I was just thinking about my own family through the course of my father's illness and our caregiving, that as we move through it, we started to see each other's strengths emerge. So for example, this will not be a surprise, is part of mine was advocacy in the hospital. Like my sisters would say, oh, we're going to send Julian for that conversation, because I'm bossy. But I had another sibling that was just really exceptional at calming my father down when he was agitated. And it would, and if she was around, we could say, oh, you just, you're so comforting for him, right? And so sometimes it's like we may not be able to have that agreement at the beginning, because we kind of have to watch each other move into these roles that maybe we've never been in before. And then when we can identify and have a deep respect for, I really appreciate how you're handling that. Thank you so much for taking more of that on. And here's what I can do.
Yeah, that rings true for me in my last little experience. My role was, I'll be the physical care guy. I can do the nursing care. And my wife was the administrator, dealing with all the phone calls, all the outside health systems, coming in, trying to coordinate stuff. And she was sort of like the coordinator office boss, and I was sort of the sort of physical care person, and that seemed to work. Something I wanted to add to what you guys have just been saying is that, of course, there's the person who is at the center. Then there are the caregivers. Then there are the people trying to support the caregivers, right? And sometimes just a little piece of things I've heard from caregivers over the years is that if you're trying to support a caregiver, you don't always have to ask them, what do you need, or what can I do for you, or call me if you need anything. Because guess what? That's never going to happen, right? Because as a caregiver, I don't have the time to lift my mind and my body out of where I am to think about my needs. And so sometimes if you're caring for a caregiver, anticipate their need. Think about where they're at, and then think, I know that person well enough that if I do this without asking, I just do it and present it, then it will either be well accepted, or it will be used, or it'll be well accepted and maybe forgotten, but that doesn't matter, because as the caregiver, I know you're out there thinking of me and you're out there trying to support me, but I just didn't have time to eat that whatever was brought in that day. You know what I mean? So that sense of, because sometimes the burden of knowing people are out there now I'm caring for my person, and now I'm having to make sure that I have to tell all my caregivers out there what it is I need. And so sometimes as the caregiver of a caregiver, just do without needing to ask. Anticipate the need. And if your anticipation hits the bullseye, it'll be really well appreciated. And if it doesn't hit the bullseye, it'll be really, really well appreciated, because that person knows that they've got people in their corner too.
So I'm just putting this out there now. So if I'm a caregiver, I don't want tuna casseroles. Okay. I'm just going to put that out there for you.
That's really too bad, because my family has a mean tuna casserole recipe.
Yeah, I've written that down.
I want to give just like a shout out. Like, here was a great example of how somebody did that for us when my father was dying. They just sent a text and they said, lunch will be there at noon today. Can someone meet the delivery person at the front door? They didn't say, do you need lunch? They didn't say, what do you want? They knew us well enough to know something that we would eat. And like, that is so helpful. And as somebody myself, through my cancer journey, where people very loving were saying, let me know what I can do. You're absolutely right, Red. I don't know what I need. I didn't know what my caregivers needed, right? So being able to say, here's what I can do. Here's what I would like to do. Would this be helpful? Could I do this? Would you let me do such and such? Be specific with that. the word, just as we start to, wind down, the word exhaustion has come out many times. And we've talked about having some step away, that reciprocity chain, letting other people help. Is there anything else that comes to mind that both of you have counseled or found yourself personally just around managing energy, especially for the long haul caregiving?
And I'll say this, and it sounds like it might not directly answer what you just asked, but I think it does. And that is, how do we as a caregiver, in looking after ourselves and our caregiving in a way that does give us energy when we're doing what we're doing? And I think I think there's ways to do that without being apart from the person. So one of those things for me is to say, can you find in this new situation, because we are living in a relational piece and an experiential piece with this person in a way that we've never experienced it before. Life back here looked like this. Life here, we still have the same people involved, but it's totally different. And one of the things I encourage people is to say, all right, can you find some meaning in what you're doing in caregiving? Is there some meaning that you can identify? And maybe that meaning is that, you know what? I sat with Dad and I got him to laugh today about something that we had remembered about life. It doesn't, we're not talking huge things. I'm talking about, can you find a way to find something in the experience that you're in that can actually feed you with a sense of meaning of this is good. We did something good today, even if that is he was able to enjoy a bite of pie. I don't know what that, but encouraging them not to see all of the value and meaning in where they've been, but what do you find in these moments before death happens? What are the experiences that we can find that will stay with us in a great way?
Yeah, I'm my thoughts are all coming at once here. Um, that to build off what you just said, David, I always say things like, or we talk about, I think talking about the concept of relief and guilt are really important before relief and guilt come. So I will often talk about exhaustion, and that at the time of death, the exhaustion is not going to end. It's just going to continue, and it's going to become even potentially more exhausting. But now is the time to look at what's happening and say, am I doing what I needed to do today? So that when I look back at this time from the other side of the death side, that I know I've done all that I can do, and that guilt that won't play a part because I can sit down and say, we did a good job today. And that then what's causing me the distress now and the exhaustion now will at some point bring comfort, because I'll know that I did what I could do, and that the person who I love who's dying had a good death, that they were comfortable, that their quality of life was maintained as long as we could, and that I played a role in helping that person depart this world in a way that was nurturing and positive. And even though that will make me cry today, and maybe even the day after, but at some time down the road, I'll be able to look back and feel comforted by that. So that all the work I'm doing right now and all the exhaustion that I'm experiencing right now grief has no place inside of that, or guilt has no place inside of that right now, and it won't later either. So that when I look back, I can go, I think we did okay. I think that was, to the best of our ability, what we could do for that person with the time that we had, so that there's comfort that grows out of the exhaustion and the sense of burden and the sense of responsibility in the caregiver role.
Well said, Red. And I know for myself, caregiving for my father at the end and afterwards, I certainly had that comfort. But I just want to add a little piece, and this has really informed how I work with caregivers when the end is approaching. And it's from my own personal experience. And one of the things that I learned was I took great comfort in knowing the kind of care we gave my father at the end of his life. And so I didn't have any guilt about the experience we gave him. But what I was left with was some remorse about the experience I gave myself. And the experience that I gave myself was, why didn't I let myself leave work? Why did I keep trying to do so many of the other things in my life? Why didn't I just step into the bubble and say, this is where I am, this is where I'm living right now? Why did I keep trying to do all of these other things? So it wasn't any remorse about what I did for him, because I felt really solid about what I gave him. But was I just thought like, well, but it was the experience I gave myself that I wish I could have stepped out of the rest of my world earlier and just been all in and said, this is where I am right now, and I can let the rest fade. So I just want to offer that's something that my own situation taught me. And I also feel like we would be remiss if we didn't speak and acknowledge for a moment the caregivers that are caregiving when it's been a hurtful relationship, where there's been maybe they're doing it out of a sense of duty, but not all of love, or when it's been a painful relationship, but they still want to do the right thing by that person. And there are no easy answers, or for us to really kind of offer around that, except I just really want to acknowledge that I have journeyed with a few people through that caregiving experience. And there's so much that comes bubbling up, those relational wounds, the sorrow of the relationship that never was and may never be, the maybe the anger, the resentment that builds up around the caregiving, around, look at everything I'm giving you and how little you've given me, things like that come up. And so for those people that are in a situation like that, my greatest wish for you would be that you would find a safe, some safe people, maybe ideally a therapist too, where you can work some of that through, because that is an enormous burden to carry, to be caregiving in a relationship that has been wounding and hurtful.
I think that's right. And good for you to remember that, Julie, and bring that up. One of the last things I wanted to just sort of talk about was that sometimes in the caregiving role, and it's the caregiver's desire, because it was the person who's dying's desire to be able to stay at home. And then you reach that place where the caregiving needs are such that they surpass the capacity of home to be able to manage. And a decision has to be made to come into hospital or into a hospice somewhere. And that can sometimes feel like failure. And it's not failure. That there are some caregiving needs that when they present are just almost impossible for family to be able to manage that at home. And one of the ways I like to sort of have that conversation with people is to say, yes, that caregiving need is beyond your capacity, and therefore you lived up to your obligation or your promise to keep them as home as long as you could, and now we've hit that spot. And now, making this transition, though, it allows you to shed that role of personal caregiver and put you back in the role of husband, wife, spouse, daughter, son, whatever the role is. And that's the person you get to be now. You can shed that other responsibility. You can still maintain some of that, certainly, if in discussion with the nurses, but that now you just get to be the family member, the friend, the whatever the relationship is, without all of those other responsibilities. But that can feel like such failure if the care needs get to that point. And I always want to reassure people that it isn't failure. It's that the disease process presented with complications that meant being at home was just impossible. And as a result of that, now you get to just be the spouse. You just get to be the son, the daughter, whatever.
that so reminds me, Red, this really, really wise man I know, his name's David Kennedy. I've heard him say many times, it's really hard to die at home, right? It's really hard to die at home. And so to your point, would you agree, David?
Absolutely.
Who is
It
this
is.
David Kennedy?
I don't
Who
know.
is that guy
I don't know.
anyway?
I'd like to meet him, actually.
He sounds smart, doesn't he?
Well, I don't know. But I
Final
think,
words?
yeah, it's
Final
been a
words?
great conversation. I'm glad we did this. I'm glad we had this conversation. I appreciate both of you with your experiences personally, and Red just recently. Thanks for sharing from your heart. And Julie, you've been both a caregiver and being cared for. And I think that perspective is really helpful. All of us, you can't be our age and not have caregiven. Let's put it that way. So, but I'm glad we decided to do this together, the three of us. I think it's been important for us to share from our own experiences and the experiences of those people that we have had the privilege of walking with. And I would just say a final word from me is for all caregivers out there, this is hard work. It's loving work for the most part. And Julie, it was important for you to say that of obligation, because I've seen that too. But as you pointed out, Red, it has a short shelf life too. It will end, and then we'll deal with the grief. So let's do this and be compassionate with ourselves. Let's give ourselves some compassion in this journey and allow us to not try to be everything for everyone. Let's keep our focus in a way that allows us to be honoring during this last period of life.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, our blessings to all the caregivers who may listen to this conversation.
You do an incredible job.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Take care, guys.
Thanks for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough. Music by Paradise Garage. Technical support provided by Sean and Jonah Heikert. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio. You can find more episodes for free on most major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Castbox, Apple Podcasts, and Overcast. If you want to support us, please follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And tell your friends. It really makes a difference.